Chicago is a city of 1,000 secrets, but for Elias Thorne, it was just a grid of expensive coffee shops and overcrowded trains that never seemed to arrive on time. At 28 years old, Elias was a freelance graphic designer who lived his life by the flicker of a dual-monitor setup, navigating the exhausting hustle of the Midwest urban landscape. Like anyone else trying to make a name for themselves in a town that thrives on ambition, he spent a significant portion of his day scrolling through rental listings, hunting for a miracle that would take him out of his cramped, shared living space and into something he could finally call his own. In the spring of 2024, that miracle appeared on his screen in the form of a studio apartment on the West Side. It was located in a converted industrial building, the kind of place that usually costs a fortune due to its high ceilings and exposed brick aesthetic. However, the price listed was nearly $400 cheaper than anything else in the entire neighborhood. To Elias, it looked like the break he had been waiting for. It was the kind of deal that felt like a reward for all those late nights and skipped meals. Before we dive into the strange reality Elias was about to walk into, I would love to know what part of the world you are currently tuning in from today. Just drop a comment below and let me know your location. When Elias arrived to sign the lease on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, he was met by the property manager, a man in his late 60s named Arthur. Arthur was dressed in a worn cardigan and moved with a strange, nervous energy. He seemed almost too eager to hand over the keys, barely glancing at the paperwork as Elias signed his name. He did not mention any dark histories, nor did he warn Elias about noisy neighbors or leaky faucets. Instead, he gave one specific and somewhat odd instruction. He told Elias that if he ever heard a humming sound coming from the utility closet near the kitchen, he should not investigate it. He told him to simply turn up his television and ignore it until the sound stopped. Elias laughed it off, assuming it was just a quirk of an old building with temperamental pipes. Elias moved in on a Friday at exactly 2:30 p.m. As he hauled the last of his boxes into the space, he could not help but feel a sense of triumph. The apartment was beautiful. The natural light poured in through the large windows, hitting the brickwork in a way that made the whole place feel warm and grounded. But as he began to unpack, he noticed a small architectural quirk that he had missed during his initial walkthrough. Situated between his bathroom and his bedroom was a narrow wooden door. It had no handle, only a simple deadbolt. It was not labeled on any map, and it certainly had not appeared on the floor plan he had seen online. It looked like an afterthought, a piece of the building that had been walled off or forgotten. He tried to turn the deadbolt once, but it felt stuck, and he quickly lost interest. He figured it was just an old access panel for the plumbing, a remnant of the building's industrial past that no longer served a purpose. For the first 3 weeks, life in the new studio was perfect. Elias was productive, his clients were happy, and he finally felt like he was gaining some momentum. But everything changed on the night of June 14th. At precisely 3:12 a.m., Elias was pulled from a deep sleep by a sound that did not belong in his bedroom. It was not a loud sound, but it was persistent. It was a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into his bed frame. He looked over at the glass of water on his nightstand and saw tiny, perfect ripples forming on the surface of the liquid. The sound was coming from that small, handleless door. Elias got out of bed, his bare feet feeling the bite of the cold, hardwood floor. He felt a prickle of unease on the back of his neck as he approached the door. He leaned in and pressed his ear against the wood, expecting to hear the metallic clanking of pipes or the whirring of an old air conditioning unit. But the sound was organic. It sounded like 1,000 people whispering at the exact same pitch, their voices layered over one another in a dense, suffocating blanket of sound. They were all saying the same word over and over again, though the muffled wood made it impossible to decipher the language. Driven by a mix of fear and an intense, irrational curiosity, Elias reached out and gripped the deadbolt. This time, it turned with ease. The metal clicked, and the door creaked open just an inch, releasing a gust of air that smelled like ozone and old, damp paper. Elias expected to see a dark crawl space or a tangle of copper pipes. Instead, he saw a hallway. But it was not a normal hallway. It was an exact replica of the hallway outside his main apartment door, complete with the same gray industrial carpet and beige wallpaper. However, it did not lead to an exit. It stretched out in both directions for what looked like miles, illuminated by a dim, sourceless yellow glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Elias grabbed his heavy flashlight from the kitchen counter and checked his watch. It was 3:17 a.m. He stepped over the threshold and into the corridor, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft, final thud. He walked for what felt like 10 minutes, passing door after door after door. Every single one of them was identical, and every single one had a small plastic sign that read 404. He tried to open one, then another, but they were all locked tight. The silence of the hallway was only broken by the sound of his own breathing and that growing, rhythmic humming. As he continued to walk, he realized the sound was getting louder, vibrating in his very marrow. He felt a sudden surge of panic and turned around to head back to his apartment. But when he looked back, the door he had entered through was gone. In its place was nothing but more beige wallpaper and another door labeled 404. He was standing in a corridor that had no beginning and no end. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone to call 911, but his heart sank when he looked at the device. The screen did not show his wallpaper or his apps. It showed a single, static image of a gray circle. There was no signal, no clock, and no way out. He began to run, his footsteps echoing against the endless gray carpet as he passed 100 more identical doors until he finally saw one that was standing slightly ajar. Elias threw his weight against it and stumbled inside, but as he looked around, the relief he expected to feel was replaced by a cold, numbing terror. Elias stood in the middle of the room, gasping for air as he scanned his surroundings. He found himself standing in his own kitchen. To his left, his half-eaten sandwich sat on the counter exactly where he had left it earlier that evening, the bread starting to curl at the edges. His laptop remained open on the small dining table, the screen glowing softly in the quiet room. A wave of intense relief washed over him, so powerful that his knees felt weak. He figured he had somehow looped back around through the strange architecture of the building and found his way home. He walked over to the sink to splash cold water on his face, trying to wash away the lingering smell of ozone and damp paper. But as he reached for the faucet, he noticed something was wrong. The light in the room was not right. It was not the warm glow of his kitchen lamp or the streetlights from outside. It was that same dim, sourceless yellow hue from the hallway. He looked at the clock on his microwave, expecting to see that it was now nearly 4 a.m. Instead, the digital display did not show numbers at all. It showed the words 404. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He slowly turned toward his laptop. The screen was no longer showing his design project. Every file on his desktop, every icon in the taskbar, and every single line of text in his open documents had been replaced with those same 3 numbers. He grabbed the mouse and tried to click, but the cursor remained frozen. He looked toward the large windows that usually offered a view of the Chicago skyline, but there were no city lights. There were no stars. The sky outside was a dull, static gray, like a television tuned to a dead channel. Elias sat down in his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs with such force that it was painful. He tried to tell himself he was dreaming, that this was some elaborate night terror brought on by stress, but the texture of the wood under his fingers was too real. He stayed there for hours, or perhaps it was days. Time had ceased to function in any way he understood. The sun never rose, and the gray void outside his window never shifted. He realized with a sinking horror that he had not actually escaped the hallway at all. He had simply entered a version of his life that was missing its soul. In the oppressive silence of this hollow apartment, his mind began to drift toward things he had long ignored. He thought about his parents, whom he had not called in weeks because he was always too busy chasing a deadline. He thought about the neighbor he had passed in the elevator a dozen times without ever saying hello. He realized that he had spent so much of his life looking for the next best thing, the cheaper rent, the higher status, and the better job, that he had stopped paying attention to the reality that actually mattered. He had been so impatient to move into this place because of the price tag that he never once questioned why it was so cheap. He had traded his connection to the real world for a bargain, and now the bargain was all he had left. The silence was eventually broken by a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the humming again, but it was no longer coming from behind the wall. It was coming from everywhere. The sound was deafening now, a physical force that made the walls of his kitchen seem to vibrate and blur. He stood up and walked toward the handleless door, which was now standing wide open, revealing the endless yellow corridor once again. As he stood at the threshold, he realized that the rhythmic vibration he had heard earlier was not just a sound, it was a chorus. The thousands of voices he had heard whispering were not speaking a foreign language. They were saying a name. They were saying his name. Thousands of unseen people were calling for Elias, their voices rising in a feverish, synchronized chant that seemed to pull at the very fabric of his being. He looked back at his half-eaten sandwich and his frozen laptop. He had a choice to make. He could stay in this static, digital tomb until his body eventually faded away into the gray, or he could go back into the hallway. He could keep walking through the yellow glow, hoping to find the version of reality he had taken for granted, the one filled with messy relationships and expensive rent and the sun rising over the lake. Elias took a deep breath, the air tasting of ozone and old paper once more. He picked up his heavy flashlight, though its beam felt weak against the sourceless light of the corridor. He stepped back through the small door and onto the gray industrial carpet. This time, he did not just leave the door open. He reached back, grabbed the edge of the wood, and pulled it shut. He turned the deadbolt, locking himself inside the hallway with the whispers. He knew that finding his way back would require a level of patience and sincerity he had never practiced before. He had to want to be home, not for the convenience or the cost, but for the life he had left behind. He began to walk, but the hallway was different now. The doors labeled 404 were no longer silent. From behind each one, he could hear the sound of a life being lived. He heard the muffled sound of a television, the clinking of silverware, and the soft laughter of a family. He stopped in front of one door and reached for the handle, but as his fingers brushed the metal, the whispering stopped instantly. The entire hallway plunged into a darkness so thick he could feel it pressing against his eyes. He clicked his flashlight on, but the beam only traveled a few inches before being swallowed by the gloom. Then, from the darkness further down the hall, he heard the sound of a single pair of footsteps, heavy and slow, walking toward him. Elias froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The footsteps were rhythmic and deliberate, the sound of heavy leather soles striking the industrial carpet with a terrifying weight. He swung his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam was useless, flickering as if the darkness itself were draining the batteries. The humming had returned, but it was no longer a distant whisper. It was a roar that seemed to vibrate inside his skull, a cacophony of his own name being shouted by a legion of voices that sounded exactly like him. He began to backtrack, his hands fumbling along the beige wallpaper as he searched for the door he had just locked. But the wall was smooth and unbroken. There was no deadbolt, no handle, and no narrow wooden frame. The hallway had shifted again, sealing him into this airless void with whatever was approaching from the gloom. The footsteps stopped just outside the circle of his failing light. Elias held his breath. the smell of ozone and damp paper now so thick it was nauseating. A voice drifted out of the darkness, but it did not come from the figure in the hall. It came from the other side of the wall, to his right. It was a woman's voice, soft and tired, asking if anyone had seen her keys. Then he heard the sound of a child laughing and the distant melody of a radio playing a song he vaguely remembered from his childhood. These were the sounds of the world he had discarded, the reality he had traded for a cheaper life in a studio apartment. He began to pound on the wallpaper with his fists, screaming for help, but his voice felt thin and hollow, as if it were being absorbed by the yellow glow. Suddenly, the darkness ahead of him broke. A figure stepped into the weak glow of his flashlight. It was not a monster or a ghost. It was a man in his late 60s, wearing a worn cardigan. Arthur, the property manager, stood there with a look of profound sadness on his face. He held a ring of keys in one hand and a heavy deadbolt lock in the other. Arthur did not speak. He simply looked at Elias and shook his head slowly, the way one might look at a stray animal that could not be saved. Arthur reached out and placed a hand on the wall where Elias had been pounding, and with a single fluid motion, he turned an invisible key. A door appeared, and Arthur stepped through it, the light of a normal Chicago afternoon spilling into the hallway for a fraction of a second before the door vanished entirely. Elias was left in total silence. The footsteps were gone. The humming had faded into a dull, background thrum. He looked down at his watch, but the hands were spinning backward at an impossible speed. He realized then that he was no longer a person in a hallway. He was a file that had been misplaced, a line of code that had been corrupted. He was the 404 error in the architecture of the universe. According to the police report filed 3 months later, the apartment of Elias Thorne was found perfectly intact. His phone was still plugged into the charger, and his laptop was running, though the screen was nothing but a field of gray static. His half-eaten sandwich remained on the kitchen counter, having long since turned to a thick green mold. There was no sign of a struggle, and no sign that Elias had ever left the room. The investigators noted the small utility door between the bathroom and the bedroom, but when they broke the lock, they found nothing but a solid brick wall that had been part of the original foundation since 1922. Arthur moved a new tenant into the unit just 2 weeks after the investigation went cold. He gave the same instruction about the humming sound near the kitchen, and he made sure to check the deadbolt on that small, handleless door every single night at 10 p.m. As the new tenant signed the lease, Arthur smiled, but his eyes remained fixed on the narrow door in the corner of the room. Once you decide that the value of your life is measured in what you can save rather than what you can give, you might find yourself in a space where nothing is ever truly earned and nothing can ever truly be kept. We are often so eager to find a shortcut to our dreams that we fail to notice when the path leads us away from our own humanity. There is a deeply rooted American dream of leaving everything behind. When the stress of modern life, the noise of the city, and the crushing weight of daily responsibilities become too much, people often fantasize about packing up their car and moving to the middle of nowhere. They believe that if they can just find a quiet piece of land deep in the mountains, they can start over. They believe the wilderness will wash away their problems. But the wilderness is entirely indifferent to human struggles. It does not heal you. It only amplifies whatever you bring into it. If you walk into the deep woods carrying paranoia, fear, and unresolved darkness, the isolation will not cure you. It will consume you. This is the tragic and deeply unsettling reality of a family who drove up into a remote mountain range looking for peace, only to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a trail of clues that are so bizarre they defy all logical explanation. Before we unpack one of the most baffling and chilling unsolved mysteries in modern history, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The year was 2009. Bobby Jameson was 44 years old, and his wife, Sherilyn Jameson, was 40. They lived in the small town of Eufaula, Oklahoma, along with their beautiful 6-year-old daughter, Madison, and their small pet dog, a mixed breed named Maisie. On paper, they looked like a normal family, but behind the closed doors of their home, their lives were slowly unraveling. Bobby had recently been involved in a severe car accident that left him with chronic, debilitating back pain. To manage the pain, he was prescribed heavy medication, which profoundly altered his mood and energy levels. Sherilyn struggled with her own severe bouts of depression and bipolar disorder. As the medical bills piled up and their physical and mental health deteriorated, the family became increasingly isolated. They stopped talking to their neighbors. They pulled Madison out of public school. The walls of their home seemed to be closing in on them. In the months leading up to October of 2009, Bobby and Sherilyn began exhibiting behavior that was deeply alarming. They started telling the few people they still spoke to that their house was haunted, but they were not talking about simple bumps in the night. Bobby seriously claimed that there were hostile, invisible spirits living on the roof of their house. He became so consumed by this delusion that he actually went to a local pastor and asked him if there was a specific type of bullet he could buy that would allow him to shoot and kill ghosts. Sherilyn, feeding off this shared paranoia, went out and purchased a .22 caliber handgun, claiming they needed to defend themselves against the entities that were stalking their family. Driven by this overwhelming fear and a desperate desire for a fresh start, the Jamesons decided they needed to move. They wanted to buy a 40-acre plot of land deep in the San Bois Mountains, near the even smaller town of Red Oak, Oklahoma. It was a rugged, heavily wooded, and isolated area. They planned to buy a shipping container, place it on the land, and live completely off the grid, far away from whatever they believed was hunting them. On October 8, 2009, the family prepared to leave for a short trip to view the land. But before they left, their home security camera captured something that would later become a cornerstone of this terrifying mystery. The camera was pointed at their driveway, recording the family as they packed their white pickup truck. The footage is incredibly disturbing to watch. It is completely silent, but the visual alone is enough to make your skin crawl. For over 2 hours, Bobby and Sherilyn are seen walking back and forth from the house to the truck. They are carrying completely mundane items, but the way they are moving is entirely unnatural. They are walking with a stiff, mechanical gait, almost like zombies. They walk past each other dozens of times in the narrow driveway, but they never make eye contact. They never stop to speak to each other. They just move back and forth in a bizarre, silent trance, their faces entirely devoid of emotion. Later that day, they loaded Madison and the dog into the truck and drove away, heading east toward the mountains. 9 days passed. On October 17th, a group of local hunters were riding their all-terrain vehicles deep in the Sans Bois Mountains. They were navigating a narrow, deeply rutted dirt path that was miles away from any paved highway. The terrain was incredibly rough, flanked by dense timber and steep ravines. As they rounded a bend, they saw a white pickup truck parked awkwardly on the side of the dirt trail. The hunters stopped their vehicles. They recognized the truck immediately. They had driven past this exact spot a few days earlier and had seen the truck sitting there. The fact that it had not moved in days in such a remote area was highly unusual. They walked up to the vehicle to see if someone needed help. The truck was locked. The hunters peered through the dirty glass of the windows. The inside of the cab was a mess of clothing, maps, and wrappers. But then, they saw something moving in the back seat. Curled up on a pile of jackets was Maisie, the family dog. The dog was severely emaciated, trembling, and barely clinging to life. She had been locked inside the freezing, airtight truck for over a week with absolutely no food or water. Realizing something was terribly wrong, the hunters immediately called the local sheriff's department. When the police arrived, they had to physically break the window to get the dog out and unlock the doors. Maisie was rushed to an animal clinic where she miraculously survived. But as the investigators began to inventory the contents of the truck, the situation escalated from an abandoned vehicle case into an absolute nightmare. Inside the truck, the police found Bobby's wallet, containing his identification and credit cards. They found Sherilyn's purse. They found both of their cell phones. They found the family's global positioning system unit, which showed that they had driven further up the mountain, stopped, and then driven back down to this specific spot before turning the engine off. They found the heavy winter coats the family would have desperately needed in the freezing autumn mountain air. But the most shocking discovery was located underneath the driver's seat. Tucked away in a bank bag was $32,000 in pure, hard cash. The investigators were completely baffled. If the family had been robbed, the criminals would have certainly taken the massive sum of money. If they had simply gotten out of the truck to go for a short walk and gotten lost, why did they leave their dog locked inside the vehicle to slowly starve to death? Why would they lock the doors behind them? And why would they leave their heavy coats inside when the temperature outside was rapidly dropping? A massive search and rescue operation was immediately launched. Over 100 volunteers, police officers with tracking dogs, and men on horseback scoured the rugged terrain surrounding the truck. They combed through the dense brush, checked the deep ravines, and searched the abandoned coal mines that dotted the landscape. The tracking dogs caught a faint scent leading away from the truck, but it quickly vanished into the wind. They searched for days, expanding the radius further and further out. They found absolutely nothing. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed the three of them whole. As the detectives dug into the evidence left inside the truck, they made a deeply unsettling discovery on one of the cell phones. It was a photograph of 6-year-old Madison. The picture appeared to have been taken somewhere on the mountain, likely on the day they disappeared. In the photo, Madison is standing with her arms crossed over her chest, but it is her expression that haunts anyone who looks at the image. She is not smiling. She looks incredibly distressed, as if she has been crying, and her eyes are looking slightly off camera, staring at someone or something with a look of pure fear. It was the last known photograph of the little girl alive. The sheer lack of physical evidence led to a chaotic storm of theories. Some investigators believed that Bobby and Sherilyn, caught in the grip of a shared drug-induced psychosis, simply wandered off into the woods and succumbed to the elements. The area was notoriously dangerous, filled with steep drops and wild animals. But this theory could not explain why they would lock the truck, leave the money, and condemn their beloved dog. Others theorized that they had stumbled across a drug manufacturing operation. The Sans Bois Mountains were known to be a hiding place for illegal methamphetamine labs. If the Jamisons had accidentally walked onto a cartel's territory while looking for land, they might have been executed to protect the secret. But again, ruthless criminals do not typically leave $32,000 in cash sitting under a seat. Another terrifying theory suggested a murder-suicide plot. Did the intense paranoia finally push one of the parents past the breaking point? Did they force their family to march out into the freezing wilderness to end it all? But without bodies, and without a weapon found in the immediate area, the police had nothing but empty speculation. The case officially went cold. For 4 years, the mystery of the Jamison family haunted the state of Oklahoma. Then, on November 16, 2013, the silence of the mountains was finally broken. Another group of hunters were trekking through a deeply isolated section of the forest, roughly 3 miles away from the spot where the white pickup truck had been abandoned 4 years earlier. This specific area had not been thoroughly searched during the initial investigation because it was extremely difficult to access and incredibly far for a 6-year-old child to walk through dense, thorny brush. One of the hunters noticed something pale contrasting against the dark autumn leaves. As he walked closer, the horrifying reality of what he was looking at came into focus. Lying on the forest floor were the skeletal remains of 3 human beings. The police were immediately notified. The medical examiner arrived at the scene. Because the bodies had been exposed to the harsh elements and scavenging animals for 4 years, there was very little physical evidence left. But the arrangement of the remains told a silent, tragic story. The 3 skeletons belonged to Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison. They were found lying face down, side by side, perfectly parallel to one another. The medical examiner took the remains back to the laboratory for a thorough analysis. The bones were heavily weathered. They could not determine the exact cause of death for Sherilyn or Madison due to the severe decomposition. There were no broken bones to suggest a fall, and no obvious knife marks. However, when they examined Bobby's skull, they found a small, mysterious hole. The coroner could not definitively state whether the hole was caused by a bullet from a small caliber weapon or if it was the result of animal activity over the years. Because the evidence was so degraded, the official cause of death for all 3 members of the Jameson family was ruled as undetermined. The discovery of the bodies only deepened the terrifying mystery. How did they get 3 miles away from their truck? The terrain was brutal. If they were lost and freezing, basic survival instincts dictate that you stay near your vehicle, which provides shelter. Why did they walk purposefully into the deepest, most unforgiving part of the woods? And why did they lay down side by side? If they were forced out there by someone else, why lay them out so methodically? If it was a murder-suicide, where was the weapon? The .22 caliber handgun that Sherilyn had purchased was never found inside the truck, and it was never found near the bodies. Did one of them use it, and then an animal carried it away? Or did someone else walk away with it? The truth of what happened on that cold October day remains buried in those mountains. But the most terrifying explanation is the one that forces us to look inward. The Jamesons were running away from invisible ghosts. They were running away from the suffocating pressure of their failing health, their financial ruin, and the demons taking root inside their own minds. When they locked the doors of their truck and walked into the dark, silent forest, they brought that paranoia with them. It is entirely possible that in the grip of an intense, shared psychological breakdown, the rustling of the wind in the trees sounded like footsteps. The shadows of the branches looked like the entities they believed were hunting them. Driven by blind, absolute terror, they abandoned their vehicle, abandoned their money, and forced their daughter to march deeper and deeper into the wilderness to escape an enemy that did not exist. When exhaustion and the freezing cold finally overtook them, they laid down together, holding onto each other as the darkness closed in. This tragic story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It speaks to a profound truth about human nature. We spend so much energy trying to outrun our problems. We change our jobs, we move to new cities, and we dream of escaping into the isolation of nature, believing that a change of scenery will bring us peace. But physical distance cannot cure an internal wound. The shadows we refuse to confront in the daylight will inevitably follow us into the dark. It teaches us a quiet lesson about the absolute necessity of facing our struggles directly. It reminds us that sincerity, patience, and the courage to ask for help when our minds begin to fail us are the only true ways to survive. The isolation they sought did not protect them. It simply provided a quiet, empty stage for their deepest fears to become a devastating reality. Life requires us to stand our ground and deal with the broken pieces of our lives, because the further we run into the unknown, the harder it becomes to ever find our way back. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an experienced hiker who went out for a short walk in a popular national park, only to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a trail of bizarre clues that made even seasoned search and rescue experts question the laws of nature. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. There is a very specific type of terror that comes from something that simply cannot happen. We are accustomed to tragedy, and we can process violence or accidents because they leave evidence behind. They leave a trail of cause and effect that our brains can understand. But what happens when the physical laws of our reality just seem to break? Imagine a room with only one door. You set up a camera pointing directly at that door. You watch a person walk through that door into the room. A few minutes later, you watch every single person inside that room walk back out. But the person you watched go in is not among them. You search the room, and it is completely empty. Where did they go? Did they dissolve into the air? Did they step into a crack in the universe? Ah, 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 ah. This is not a thought experiment. This is exactly what happened to a young man in Ohio, in a case that remains one of the most baffling, logically impossible mysteries ever recorded. Before we dive into the impossible vanishing of this young man, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The year was 2006. The city was Columbus, Ohio. Brian Schaefer was 27 years old, and on the surface, his life was moving in a brilliant direction. He was a second-year medical student at Ohio State University, a bright, handsome, and deeply intelligent young man with a promising future as a doctor. He had a beautiful girlfriend named Alexis, who was also a medical student, and they were deeply in love. In fact, Brian had recently purchased a ring and was planning to ask Alexis to marry him during an upcoming vacation they had booked to Miami, Florida. They were scheduled to fly out on a Monday, just a few days away. But underneath the surface of this perfect life, Brian was carrying a heavy, suffocating weight. Just 3 weeks prior to this story, Brian had lost his mother to a grueling battle with cancer. He had been incredibly close to her, and her death had left a massive, hollow void in his heart. He was trying to hold it together, pushing through his grueling medical exams and keeping a brave face for his family and Alexis. But the grief was a constant, heavy shadow following him everywhere. On Friday, March 31st, 2006, Brian finished his final medical exams for the quarter. It was the beginning of spring break. He and his father went out to dinner that evening. His father noticed that Brian looked exhausted. The late nights of studying, combined with the raw, unprocessed grief of losing his mother, were clearly taking a toll on him. His father told him he should just go home, get some rest, and pack for his trip to Miami. But Brian declined. He said he was going to meet up with his friend and fellow medical student, Clint, to celebrate the end of their exams. He needed a distraction. He needed to blow off some steam. Around 9 p.m., Brian met up with Clint at a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloona. This location is absolutely crucial to understanding the sheer impossibility of what was about to happen. The Ugly Tuna Saloona was located inside a large entertainment complex in the University District, but the bar was not on the ground floor. It was located on the second floor of the building. To get into the bar, you had to walk into the ground floor lobby and ride a long escalator up to the second level. At the top of the escalator, there was a small landing and then the main entrance doors leading into the bar. Most importantly, the building was equipped with security cameras. There was a camera mounted on the ceiling right outside the Ugly Tuna Saloona. This camera continuously panned back and forth, capturing the top of the escalator, the landing, and the front doors of the bar. It was the only public entrance and the only public exit. If you went into the bar, you were caught on that camera. If you left the bar, you were caught on that camera. Brian and Clint started their night at the Ugly Tuna. They had a few drinks, catching up and enjoying the loud, energetic atmosphere of the college crowd. After a while, they decided to do some bar hopping. They left the Ugly Tuna, went back down the escalator, and visited a few other establishments in the immediate area. They drank, they talked to friends, and they tried to drown out the heavy stress of the past few weeks. As the night wore on, they met up with a female friend named Meredith. The three of them continued their night out, eventually deciding to head back to where they started. At 1:15 a.m., early Saturday morning on April 1st, the security camera at the Ugly Tuna Saloon captured Brian, Clint, and Meredith riding the escalator back up to the second floor. The footage shows them clearly. They step off the escalator, walk across the landing, and disappear through the doors into the crowded bar. The bar was incredibly packed. The music was deafening. The air was hot and humid from hundreds of bodies pressing together, and the drinks were flowing. Clint and Meredith found a spot near the bar, but Brian told them he was going to walk around and see if he could find some other friends. He wandered off into the dense crowd, disappearing into the sea of people. Time slipped away. At 1:55 a.m., just 5 minutes before the bar was scheduled to close for the night, the security camera outside the entrance captured Brian once again. The footage shows Brian stepping out of the front doors of the bar. He walks onto the landing near the top of the escalator. He is talking to two young women. They stand there for a brief moment, chatting. Brian looks totally normal. He is not stumbling. He does not look distressed, and he does not seem to be in any kind of danger. He says goodbye to the two women. The women turn and walk toward the escalator to leave the building. Brian, however, does not follow them. The camera clearly shows him turn around, face the entrance of the Ugly Tuna Saloon, and walk back toward the doors. He steps out of the frame, heading directly back into the bar. At 2 a.m., the harsh, bright, overhead lights of the Ugly Tuna Saloon turned on. The music abruptly cut off. The bartenders started shouting for everyone to finish their drinks and head toward the exit. It was closing time. Clint and Meredith were standing near the front, waiting for Brian. As the massive crowd began to funnel out of the doors and down the escalator, they kept their eyes peeled for their friend. They watched hundreds of college students shuffle past them. The crowd slowly thinned out until the bar was completely empty. The staff began wiping down the tables and sweeping the floors, but Brian never came out. Clint and Meredith checked the bathrooms. They were empty. They walked around the entire second-floor landing. Nothing. Clint tried calling Brian's cell phone multiple times, but it went straight to voicemail. Frustrated and assuming that Brian had perhaps met up with someone else and left without telling them, or simply decided to walk home to his apartment, Clint and Meredith gave up. They walked down the escalator and went home. Saturday morning arrived. Alexis, Brian's girlfriend, called him several times, eager to talk about their trip to Miami. Her calls went directly to voicemail. She thought it was slightly strange, but she figured he was just sleeping off a heavy night of drinking. As the day progressed into evening, and Brian still had not returned any calls from Alexis, Clint, or his father, a cold sense of unease began to settle over the family. Brian was not the type of person to completely ignore his phone, especially not with a major trip coming up. By Sunday, the unease had turned into pure panic. Brian had a flight to catch on Monday morning. He had not been home. His car was still parked at his apartment. His luggage was not packed. Monday morning came. Alexis stood at the airport departure gate in absolute agony, watching the passengers board the flight to Miami. She waited until the very last second, praying she would see Brian running down the terminal. But he never showed up. The plane doors closed, and the plane took off without him. At that exact moment, Alexis knew something was horribly wrong. The family immediately contacted the Columbus police and officially reported Brian Schaefer missing. The police launched an investigation, initially assuming this was a standard case of a young man who had perhaps wandered off and gotten into an accident. They requested the security footage from the Ugly Tuna Saloon, focusing entirely on the night of Friday, March 31st, and the early hours of Saturday, April 1st. The detectives sat in a dark room. Watching the grainy footage, they saw Brian, Clint, and Meredith ride the escalator up at 1:15 a.m. They fast-forwarded. They watched the footage at 1:55 a.m. They saw Brian walk out, talk to the two women, turn around, and walk back toward the bar entrance. Then, the detectives watched the footage from 2 a.m. until the bar was completely empty. They watched every single person walk out of those doors and go down the escalator. They paused the tape, they rewound it, they watched it again. They focused on every face, every jacket, every gate. Brian Schaffer never walked out. The detectives were baffled. They thought they must have missed something. They implemented a painstaking manual counting process. They counted every single person who went up the escalator that night. Then they counted every single person who came down the escalator. The numbers did not lie. Every single person who went up that night came back down, except for one, Brian. How does a 27-year-old man vanish from a second-floor bar with only one public exit? The police immediately secured the building. They brought in highly trained search dogs. The dogs were given a piece of Brian's unwashed clothing to pick up his scent. The dogs tracked his scent through the ground floor lobby, up the escalator, across the landing, and into the Ugly Tuna Saloon. The dogs wandered around the bar floor, following his path through the crowd. But then, the scent just stopped. The dogs spun in circles, confused. They could not find a trail leading out. It was as if Brian had evaporated into thin air right there on the bar floor. The authorities began to look for alternative exits. If he did not go down the escalator, he had to have left through another door. The only other way out of the Ugly Tuna Saloon was a set of emergency service doors located in the back of the building. These doors were strictly for staff and deliveries. The police investigated the service doors. If Brian had somehow slipped through them without anyone noticing, he would have found himself in a chaotic, highly dangerous environment. The back of the building was a massive, active construction site. It was dark, filled with deep trenches, exposed rebar, concrete pillars, and steep drops. It was a labyrinth of scaffolding and debris. But there was a major problem with this theory. The service doors were not meant for public use. They were heavy, and they opened up to a route that was notoriously difficult to navigate even in the daylight. More importantly, the construction site was heavily monitored by motion-sensitive security cameras to prevent theft. The police pulled every single hour of footage from the construction site cameras for that entire weekend. They watched the tapes, looking for any sign of movement, any shadow, any sign of a person stumbling through the dark. The motion sensors were never tripped. The cameras captured absolutely nothing. Furthermore, police scoured the entire construction zone. They brought the tracking dogs through the debris. They looked down every trench and inside every concrete pipe. They found zero physical evidence that anyone had been there. There was no blood, no torn clothing, no footprints in the mud. The situation was entirely impossible. He did not leave through the front. He did not leave through the back. He was not inside the bar. Desperation set in. Prevent. The police theorized that perhaps Brian had changed his clothes to disguise himself and slipped past the front camera. They meticulously interviewed every single person who was in the bar that night. They tracked down the two women he was seen speaking to at 1:55 a.m. The women confirmed they spoke to him briefly, said goodbye, and left. They had no idea where he went afterward. They checked Brian's bank accounts, his credit cards, and his cell phone records. After the night he vanished, his phone never pinged another cell tower. His credit cards were never swiped. His bank accounts remained completely untouched. He had simply ceased to exist. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. The disappearance of Brian Schaffer became a national obsession. It is the ultimate locked room mystery playing out in real life. People analyzed the footage frame by frame, suggesting wild theories. Some believed that Brian, overwhelmed by the grief of losing his mother and the pressure of medical school, had meticulously planned his own disappearance. finding an unseen blind spot in the camera system to escape and start a new life. But his family entirely rejected this. Brian loved Alexis. He was about to propose. He loved his father and his brother. He would never inflict that kind of agonizing pain on them, especially so soon after his mother's death. Others believed he met with foul play inside the bar. They suggested that an altercation occurred in the back rooms, and his body was somehow smuggled out in a trash bin or hidden within the walls of the construction site before the concrete was poured. The police brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan the concrete pillars of the new construction, desperate to find an anomaly that might be a human body. The radar found nothing. The ugly tuna saloona eventually closed its doors permanently, but the mystery of what happened inside that building continues to haunt anyone who hears it. This story forces us to confront a very uncomfortable reality about our lives. We spend all our time building foundations. We go to school, we plan vacations, we buy rings for the people we love, and we operate under the absolute assumption that tomorrow is a guaranteed event. We believe that the ground beneath our feet is solid. But life is an incredibly fragile, unpredictable current. The physical world can shift in ways we cannot comprehend. It teaches us a quiet lesson about the sincerity of our connections. We never truly know when the last time we speak to someone will be. We never know when a simple goodbye will become a permanent silence. The grief that Brian's family endured, waiting for a phone call that never came, waiting for a door to open that remained shut forever, is a stark reminder to hold the people we care about close. It is a reminder to live with patience, to express our love sincerely, and to never let a disagreement linger into the night, because the universe does not owe us closure. It does not owe us an explanation. Sometimes, the people we love the most simply step out of the frame, and we are left staring at an empty room for the rest of our lives. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves a massive, isolated mountain range where a young boy vanished into thin air, only to be found days later miles away, telling a story about a creature that defies every law of nature. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. Imagine walking into a freezing, dark cabin in the middle of an isolated forest. You are shivering uncontrollably, starving and terrified. Right in front of you, stacked neatly on the shelves, is enough food to last an entire year. Just outside the door is a full propane tank connected to a heater inside the room. All you have to do is turn a small valve, strike a single match, or open a can of food. But instead of saving your own life, you just lie down in the freezing dark, pull a blanket up to your chin, and slowly waste away. This is not a hypothetical scenario from a horror movie. This is exactly what happened in one of the most baffling, unsettling, and heartbreaking mysteries in American history. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in a story format, you have come to the right place. Please take a moment to gently tap the like button and subscribe so you never miss out on these unsettling stories. It was the evening of February 24th, 1978. 5 best friends from Yuba City, California, were piling into a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego. The air was brisk, but the men were entirely consumed by excitement. These men were Ted Weyer, Gary Mathias, Jack Madruga, Jack Hewitt, and Bill Sterling. They ranged in age from 24 to 32, and they were a very unique group of friends. Each of them had some form of mild cognitive disability or psychiatric condition, but they were high-functioning, held down jobs, lived safely at home with their parents, and shared an intense, unbreakable bond over one single passion. That passion was basketball. They had formed their own team called the Gateway Gators. The very next day, they were scheduled to play their first game in a regional Special Olympics tournament. The stakes were incredibly high in their eyes, as the winning team would get a free week-long trip to Los Angeles. They were so thrilled about the tournament that some of them had already carefully laid out their freshly washed uniforms on their beds before leaving the house that evening. They wanted to be completely ready for the morning. But tonight, they were taking a short road trip. They were driving 50 miles north to the town of Chico to watch a college basketball game. Jack Madruga was behind the wheel. He loved his car fiercely and drove it with extreme, almost overly cautious care. The college game was lively, and the boys had a fantastic time cheering from the bleachers. The game ended around 10 p.m. Afterward, the group stopped at a small local market just down the street from the gymnasium. The store clerk vividly remembered them. They were cheerful and polite, buying Hostess cherry pies, candy bars, and sodas to snack on during the ride back. It was about 10:30 p.m. when they walked out of the brightly lit store, got back into the Mercury Montego, and drove off into the dark California night. They were supposed to head south, taking a straight, easy, and very familiar highway directly back to Yuba City. Their parents expected them to be home safely in their beds by midnight at the absolute latest. But midnight came and went. The house phones remained silent. The boys did not return. By 6 a.m. the next morning, the parents were awake and frantically calling each other's houses. By 8 a.m., the police had been notified. The authorities initially tried to calm the parents down, suggesting the men had simply taken a detour, perhaps deciding to stay over at a friend's house or got a flat tire. But the mothers and fathers knew better. These 5 men were strict creatures of habit. They never missed a curfew without calling home, and more importantly, they would never, ever risk missing their big basketball tournament that morning. For them to miss the game they had trained months for, something had to be horribly, terribly wrong. Days turned into a week, and a massive search effort across the local highways yielded absolutely nothing. It was as if the turquoise car and the 5 men had vanished off the face of the earth. Then, a breakthrough happened, but it only deepened the terror. A park ranger reported seeing an abandoned car parked on a remote, unpaved logging road deep inside the Plumas National Forest. The location made absolutely no sense. The car was found 70 miles away from Chico, in the complete opposite direction of Yuba City. It was high up in the mountains, at a freezing elevation of 4,400 feet. The police rushed to the scene immediately. It was indeed Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego. When investigators arrived at the vehicle, the clues they found shattered every logical theory they had. The car was sitting perfectly upright on the snow-covered dirt road. There were no dents, no scratches, and no signs of any kind of accident or struggle. The keys were missing, but when the police hot-wired the ignition, the engine roared to life immediately. The gas tank was a quarter full. The tires were in perfect condition. The car was slightly bogged down in a shallow snowdrift, but 5 grown men could have easily pushed it out in less than a minute. Even more bizarre, the candy wrappers and empty soda cans from the market in Chico were neatly folded and left inside the cabin. But there was no trace of the 5 men. The authorities were completely baffled. Why would Jack Madruga, a man who hated driving on unfamiliar roads and treated his car like a prized possession, drive up a treacherous, winding, unpaved mountain road in the dead of winter? They were far from home, heading into absolute wilderness, wearing clothes meant for a mild California evening indoors. They were dressed in light windbreakers, jeans, and low-top sneakers. The temperature up on that mountain was plummeting toward 0 degrees. And why, when the car got slightly stuck, did they abandon a perfectly working vehicle that could have provided shelter, safety, and a functioning heater? Shortly after the car was found, the police received a deeply disturbing tip. A local man named Joseph Shones came forward with a story that sounded like a nightmare. He told police that on the exact night the men went missing, he was driving his own truck up that very same logging road. He was looking for the snow line because he wanted to bring his family up for a ski trip that coming weekend. His truck got deeply stuck in the snow. While he was outside, violently shoveling the snow trying to free his tires, he experienced a sudden, massive heart attack. Lying inside his freezing truck, writhing in excruciating pain and entirely convinced he was going to die right there on the mountain, he suddenly saw headlights illuminating the trees from down the road. It was around 11:30 p.m. He saw a car park a short distance behind him. He heard the muffled sound of voices drifting through the freezing air. Desperate for his life, Shones pushed his door open, stepped out of his truck, and yelled for help at the top of his lungs. Through the blinding glare of the headlights, he claimed he saw a group of men, and strangely, a woman holding a baby. But the very moment he called out to them, the voices instantly stopped. The headlights were abruptly shut off. The pitch-black woods went dead silent. Shones called out again, pleading for them to help a dying man. He received absolutely no answer. It was as if the group had dissolved into the shadows. Shones eventually managed to survive the night and painfully walked back down the mountain the next morning to get help. His story baffled investigators. The footprints around Madruga's abandoned car perfectly matched the 5 missing men. But who was the woman with the baby? And why on earth would these 5 friendly, gentle men completely ignore a dying man screaming for help in the pitch-black woods? Before the police could launch a full-scale ground search of the deep forest, severe winter storms battered the mountain range. A brutal blizzard dumped snow continuously for weeks, piling up to 15 feet high in some areas. The search had to be entirely called off. It was too dangerous for the rescue teams. The parents of the 5 men were left in a state of agonizing, unending limbo. Months slowly passed. The heavy snow slowly began to melt as the warmth of spring finally arrived. In early June, exactly 114 days after the men disappeared into the night, a small group of motorcyclists were riding their dirt bikes on a very rough, remote trail deep inside the forest. They were nearly 20 miles uphill from the spot where the Mercury Montego had been abandoned. They came out into a clearing and stumbled upon a United States Forest Service trailer. It was a small, heavy-duty cabin used by park rangers during the summer months. The bikers noticed that the front window of the trailer had been violently broken out. Curious and slightly uneasy, they parked their bikes and looked inside the shattered window. The overwhelming smell of decay hit them first. Then, peering into the gloom, they saw the body. It was Ted Wire. He was lying squarely on a bed, completely wrapped from head to toe in 8 thick sleeping bags and heavy blankets. He was severely emaciated, his body reduced to a skeleton covered in skin, and his feet were completely ruined by severe frostbite. The bikers fled in terror and notified the authorities. When investigators swarmed the remote trailer a few hours later, the scene they documented inside made absolutely no logical sense. It defied human survival instincts. Forensic analysis revealed that Ted Wire had lived inside that dark, freezing trailer for up to 3 agonizing months after the night he went missing. His thick beard growth and the extreme loss of body weight indicated he had survived for many weeks, slowly and painfully starving and freezing to death. But the trailer was fully stocked with emergency supplies. All around the room were heavy winter coats, insulated boots, and extra sleeping bags, all left completely untouched. There was a large propane tank sitting right outside the trailer, directly connected to a large space heater inside. All Ted or his friends had to do was reach out and turn a simple metal valve to flood the room with life-saving heat. The valve was never turned. There were dozens of paperback books, paper materials, and wooden furniture that could have easily been used to start a fire in the fireplace. There were dry matches sitting right on the table in plain sight. No fire was ever made. But the most horrifying discovery of all was the food supply. In a small storage shed directly attached to the outside of the trailer, there was enough freeze-dried food, canned vegetables, fruits, and heavy military rations to comfortably feed all 5 men for an entire year. Investigators found that a tiny handful of cans had been opened and eaten. They were opened with a specialized military P-38 can opener. Gary Mathias, the only Army veteran in the group, was known to carry this exact type of can opener on his keychain. But after those first few cans, the men just stopped eating. The rest of the massive food hoard, literally an arm's length away from where Ted lay dying, was left completely untouched. Ted Wire, a man who weighed over 200 pounds when he vanished after the basketball game, weighed just 73 pounds when he was found wrapped in those blankets. He had slowly starved to death in a room absolutely overflowing with food. The police immediately fanned out to search the surrounding wilderness. Within a few days, the grim discoveries continued. They found the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling in a deep drainage ditch along the dirt road leading up to the trailer. Autopsies showed they had died of extreme hypothermia while attempting the grueling 20-mile hike up the mountain in the pitch dark. Further deep into the dense woods, searchers found the scattered, animal-scavenged bones of Jack Hewitt. His jeans and shoes were left nearby, and his father's heavy jacket, which he had been proudly wearing that night, was found discarded miles away. But Gary Mathias, the Army veteran and the most capable survivor of the group, was never found. The only trace of him was his low-top tennis shoes, which were found sitting neatly inside the trailer next to Ted's bed. It appeared that after Ted passed away, or perhaps shortly before, Gary put on Ted's heavier, warmer leather boots, stepped out of the trailer into the unforgiving winter wilderness, and walked away into oblivion. He was never seen or heard from again. The tragedy of the Yuba County Five leaves behind a chilling, impenetrable wall of questions. What terrifying thing drove these 5 men to abandon a perfectly safe working car and march 20 miles uphill through deep, freezing snow into total darkness, wearing nothing but light jackets? Why did they ignore Joseph Shones as he begged for his life? And, most hauntingly, why did the survivors, who actually reached the safety of the trailer, refuse to use the heat, the fire, or the massive pile of food that could have easily saved their lives? Psychologists and investigators have theorized for decades. Some believe the men saw something illegal or terrifying happening on that logging road, perhaps related to the mysterious woman and baby that Shones claimed to have seen. Maybe they genuinely believed they were being hunted in the dark. Their specific cognitive challenges might have caused them to panic entirely, their minds unable to process the fear, leading them to make highly irrational decisions. When they finally reached the Forest Service trailer after hiking for days in the snow, they had to break a window to get inside. It is highly likely they were so deeply afraid of getting in trouble with the law for breaking and entering into government property that their rigid minds refused to allow them to touch the supplies. They might have huddled together in the freezing dark, paralyzed by rules and fear, simply waiting for someone to come save them, until the bitter, cold, and unrelenting hunger slowly took them one by one. Ted Wire, known by his family to lack common sense, but possessing an incredibly gentle soul, might have simply stayed in the bed where his friends tucked him in, patiently waiting for Gary to bring back help that would never arrive. There is a quiet, haunting beauty and immense tragedy in their final days. They never turned on each other. The ones who made it to the cabin tried their best to care for Ted. They tucked him into bed. They wrapped him in every blanket they could find. They stayed by his side in the dark. It speaks to a profound truth about life. Sometimes, the most innocent, trusting, and gentle souls among us are the most vulnerable to the chaotic, unforgiving nature of the world. Life demands a harsh adaptability. A single wrong turn in the dark, a moment of blinding panic, or a stubborn adherence to the rules, even when survival is on the line, can lead to devastating consequences. Their story is a stark reminder that the wilderness does not care about your good intentions, your fears, or your innocence. The physical world is entirely indifferent. The thick mountain forest swallowed their final moments, keeping the true, horrifying sequence of events locked permanently beneath the winter snow. The parents of the 5 men lived out the rest of their days consumed by the agonizing question of what chased their boys up that mountain. And Gary Mathias remains missing to this very day, a ghost wandering the Plumas National Forest. The strange case of the Yuba County 5 remains one of the darkest, most impenetrable mysteries of the American outdoors. There are many more stories hidden in the dark corners of the world, waiting to be uncovered. And perhaps the next one will chill you even deeper to the bone. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do. We upload at least 3 of these stories every single week. So if that is something you are into, please go ahead and invite the like button over for a nice dinner, but then insist on eating in total silence while staring directly at their forehead. Tonight, we are looking at a case that takes place in a small, quiet town in the Pacific Northwest called Oak Haven. It is the kind of place where people move to get away from the noise of Seattle or Portland. It is surrounded by thick, ancient forests that seem to swallow the light, and for most people who live there, the biggest drama is usually a fallen tree or a local deer getting into someone's garden. But for a woman named Sarah Jenkins, Oak Haven was about to become the setting of a mystery that would defy everything she knew about reality. It was 11:45 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday in October 2025. Sarah was sitting in a dimly lit, high-tech room at the Oak Haven Emergency Communications Center. She was a veteran emergency dispatcher, someone who had heard it all. She had talked people through heart attacks, guided fathers through delivering babies in the back of minivans, and calmed down frantic callers during house fires. She was calm, professional, and almost impossible to rattle. The night shift was usually slow. The only sounds in the room were the hum of the cooling fans from the computer towers and the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. Sarah was sipping a lukewarm cup of black coffee, staring at her monitors, waiting for the next call to come in. At exactly midnight, her console lit up. A call was coming through. Sarah adjusted her headset, clicked her mouse to accept the line, and gave her standard greeting. 911. What is your emergency? There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. All Sarah could hear was a faint, static hiss and the sound of heavy, ragged breathing. It sounded like someone was running, or perhaps they were in extreme pain. Hello? This is 911. Do you have an emergency? Sarah repeated. Her voice steady but firm. Finally, a voice came through, but it was not screaming. It was a whisper, a woman's voice, trembling with a level of terror that Sarah had never encountered in her 10 years on the job. You have to help me, the voice said. He is inside. He is coming up the stairs right now. Sarah immediately went into professional mode. Her fingers began flying across the keyboard. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. What is your address? There was a loud thud on the other end of the line, like a door being kicked in. The caller let out a muffled sob. 142 North Maple Drive, the woman whispered. My name is Sarah Jenkins. Please, he has a knife. He is at the door. Sarah froze. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a second, the entire room seemed to tilt. 142 North Maple Drive was not just a random address. It was her address, and Sarah Jenkins was her name. She looked at the caller ID display on her screen. Usually, it would show a phone number or a GPS coordinate. But tonight, the box for the caller information was blank, except for a timestamp that sat at the very bottom of the metadata. It read, October 29th, 2025, 12:10 a.m. Sarah looked at the clock on her wall. It was currently midnight on October 28th. According to her system, this call was coming from 10 minutes in the future. She felt a cold wave of nausea wash over her. She thought it was a prank, perhaps a coworker playing a cruel joke. But the voice on the other end did not sound like a recording. It sounded exactly like her. The cadence, the slight rasp in the throat, the way she pronounced her S's, it was her own voice, screaming in a future that had not happened yet. "Ma'am, who is this?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking for the first time in her career. "I told you, it is Sarah. He is in the room. I am hiding in the closet, but the door is opening. Oh, God, please." Then a sickening sound came through the headset. It was a wet, tearing noise, followed by a sharp, guttural cry that was cut off abruptly. There was a heavy thud, the sound of something hitting a carpeted floor, and then the line went dead. Sarah sat in total silence. Her breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. She looked around the dispatch center, but the other dispatcher on duty, a man named Dave, was in the break room getting a snack. She was alone. She looked at the clock again. It was 12:02 a.m. She had 8 minutes. Her mind was racing. If that call was real, someone was going to break into her house in 8 minutes and kill her. But she was here, at work. She was safe behind locked doors and security cameras. How could she be at her house and at the dispatch center at the same time? Then she remembered. She was supposed to have stayed home tonight. She had traded shifts with Dave at the last minute because she wanted to finish a project at the office. If she had stayed home, she would be at 142 North Maple Drive right now. She grabbed her cell phone and dialed her home security system. She had cameras in the living room and the hallway. She opened the app, her hand shaking so hard she almost dropped the phone. The feed loaded slowly. The living room was dark and quiet. Everything looked normal. She checked the clock on the camera feed. 12:04 a.m. She began to tell herself that it had to be a prank. Some hacker must have found a way to spoof the 911 system and use an AI voice generator to mimic her. It was the only logical explanation. But as she watched the screen, she saw a shadow move across the back patio. A man was standing outside her glass sliding door. He was wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt and a mask that obscured his face. In his right hand, he held a long, serrated kitchen knife. Sarah's blood turned to ice. This was not a prank. She watched as the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. He pressed it against the glass, and a second later, the entire sliding door shattered silently. He stepped into her living room. Sarah did not hesitate. She picked up her radio and called for backup. She dispatched every available unit to her own address, reporting a home invasion in progress. She stayed on the line with the officers, her voice returning to that professional, robotic calm that she used to survive the job. "Units are en route, Sarah," Dave said, coming back into the room and seeing the look on her face. "What's going on?" "Someone is in my house," she whispered, pointing at the phone screen. They watched together as the intruder moved through the house with a chilling sense of purpose. He did not look for jewelry or electronics. He went straight for the stairs. He climbed them slowly, one by one. 12:08 a.m. The man reached the top of the stairs and turned toward the master bedroom. He kicked the door open. Sarah watched on her phone as he scanned the empty room. He looked confused. He turned toward the closet, the exact place where the voice on the phone said she was hiding. He ripped the closet door open and lunged inside, swinging the knife. But the closet was empty. Sarah felt a surge of triumph. She had changed the future. Because she had decided to come into work, the timeline had shifted. She was not there to be killed. But then the man in the video stopped. He looked directly at the security camera mounted in the corner of the room. It was as if he knew she was watching him. He reached up, grabbed the camera, and the feed went black. 12:10 a.m. The exact time the call from the future was supposed to have ended. Sarah leaned back in her chair, shaking. Dave put a hand on her shoulder. "The police are there now, Sarah. They'll get him." They waited for the radio to crackle with news of an arrest. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. Finally, the lead officer, a veteran named Sergeant Miller, came over the air. "Sarah, we've cleared the house. All floors are secure." Did you get him? Sarah asked, leaning toward the desk. That's the thing, Sarah, Miller replied, his voice sounding puzzled. The house is empty. There's no sign of a break-in. The sliding door is perfectly intact. The bedroom door is locked from the inside. We had to force entry, but there is nobody here. Sarah frowned. But I saw him. I saw him break the glass. I saw him go into my bedroom. I have the recording on my phone. She opened her app to show Dave the recorded footage. But when she clicked on the history for 12 a.m., there was nothing. The log showed that the cameras had been offline for the past hour due to a scheduled firmware update. There was no footage of a man with a knife. There was no broken glass. Sarah felt a cold dread sink into her bones. She went home that night, escorted by 4 police officers. They searched every inch of the property again. They looked under the beds, in the attic, and behind the bushes. Nothing. The house was a fortress. For the next week, Sarah could not sleep. She jumped at every sound. She installed 3 more locks on every door and bought a heavy-duty safe for her bedroom. She became obsessed with the call. She went back into the dispatch archives to find the recording of the 911 call from that night. She found the log entry for 12 midnight, but when she played the audio, there was no voice. There was no screaming. There was only 10 minutes of absolute, dead silence. She began to wonder if she had suffered some kind of mental break. Perhaps the stress of the job had finally caught up to her, and she had hallucinated the entire thing. Her coworkers started looking at her with pity. Dave suggested she take some time off. But Sarah knew what she had heard. She knew the sound of her own voice dying. Months passed, and the memory began to fade, as traumatic memories often do. She started to convince herself that it really was just a strange glitch in the system combined with a panic attack. She went back to her normal routine. It was exactly 1 year later, October 28th, 2026. Sarah was at home. She had the night off. She was sitting in her living room, reading a book, feeling peaceful for the first time in a long time. The rain was drumming against the roof, a familiar, comforting sound in Oak Haven. She looked at the clock on the mantel. It was 11:45 p.m. Suddenly, her cell phone rang. She picked it up off the coffee table. The caller ID was blank. She felt a prickle of fear, but she answered it anyway. Hello? There was silence for a few seconds. Then, a voice. It was a woman's voice, calm and professional. 911. What is your emergency? Sarah dropped the book. The voice on the phone was her own, but it was not her voice from right now. It was the voice she used when she was at work. It was her dispatcher voice. Who is this? Sarah whispered. The voice on the other end continued. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. What is your address? Sarah realized with a jolt of horror what was happening. She wasn't the caller this time. She was the one being watched. She looked toward the back of the house. Through the reflection in the dark window, she saw a shadow move across the patio. A man in a dark, hooded sweatshirt was standing there. He held a serrated kitchen knife in his right hand. He didn't have a device to break the glass this time. He didn't need one, because Sarah, in her paranoia over the last year, had replaced the glass with a reinforced sliding door that had a specific flaw in the latch that she had forgotten to fix. The man reached out, jiggled the handle, and the door slid open with a smooth, silent hiss. Sarah scrambled off the couch, her heart hammering against her ribs. She realized that the call she had heard a year ago wasn't from 10 minutes in the future. It was from a year in the future. The system hadn't glitched the date, it had glitched the year. She ran for the stairs, her phone still pressed to her ear. She could hear her own voice from a year ago, speaking to her from the dispatch center. Ma'am, stay calm. Units are en route. But Sarah knew the truth now. The units weren't en route, because a year ago she had sent them to an empty house where nothing was happening. Tonight, because of the false alarm she had triggered back then, the police had flagged her address as a low priority for phantom calls. She reached the top of the stairs and ran into her bedroom. She slammed the door and locked it. She scrambled into the closet, pulling the slatted doors shut behind her. She heard the bedroom door kick open. She heard the heavy footsteps on the carpet. She huddled in the darkness, surrounded by the smell of her own clothes. She whispered into the phone, hoping that somehow her past self could hear the truth. "He is in the room. I am hiding in the closet, but the door is opening. Oh God, please." The closet door was ripped open. The last thing Sarah Jenkins saw was the flash of a serrated blade in the moonlight. In the end, Sarah had spent a whole year trying to outrun a ghost, only to realize that every step she took to protect herself was actually building the trap she would eventually fall into. We often think that by knowing the future, we can change it, but sometimes the map we are given is the very thing that leads us to the end of the road. The Oak Haven police eventually found the man. He was a drifter who had been obsessed with Sarah for years, watching her from the woods, waiting for the perfect moment when she would be most vulnerable. He told the police that the only reason he found the courage to enter the house was because he saw her installing so many locks, and he realized how afraid she truly was. But as for that 911 call, it remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of the department. The recording of the silence still sits in the archives, a 10-minute gap where a woman's life was supposedly saved, only to be taken exactly 365 days later. But that is a story for another time. There is a profound and comforting illusion that we all rely on every single night before we go to sleep. We walk around our homes, we turn off the kitchen lights, we make sure the stove is off, and we turn the deadbolt on the front door. We listen to the heavy metal click of the lock, and in that sound, we find an absolute sense of security. We believe that 4 walls and a locked door are enough to keep the chaos of the outside world completely separate from our safe, private lives. We believe that if danger ever tries to cross our threshold, there will be a loud struggle, a broken window, or enough time to dial 911. But what happens when the very place you feel the most secure becomes the site of an impossible vanishing? What happens when 3 grown women disappear from a small suburban house in the middle of the night, leaving behind their money, their cars, their clothes, and absolutely no sign of a struggle, as if they simply dissolved into the warm summer air? Before we unlock the doors to one of the most chilling and perplexing unsolved mysteries in American history, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The city of Springfield, Missouri, in the early summer of 1992, was the quintessential picture of Midwestern peace. It was a place where neighbors knew each other by name, kids rode their bikes down tree-lined streets until the streetlights came on, and violent crime was something that happened in other, bigger cities. June 6th was a particularly joyous day in Springfield. It was graduation day for the local high school. The air was thick with the humidity of early summer and the infectious excitement of hundreds of teenagers stepping into the adult world. Among those graduates were 2 beautiful, vibrant young women named Susie Streeter and Stacy McCall. Susie was 19 years old, known for her outgoing personality and her striking blonde hair. Stacy was 18 years old, a sweet, deeply loved young woman who was eagerly preparing for her upcoming college years. The 2 girls had been friends for a long time, and they had spent weeks planning the perfect way to celebrate their graduation night. Their original plan was to leave Springfield right after the graduation ceremonies and drive down to Branson, Missouri, where they had booked a hotel room. They were going to spend the weekend swimming, exploring, and celebrating with a large group of their classmates. But as graduation day wore on, those plans slowly began to unravel. The hotel in Branson fell through due to a miscommunication, and the girls found themselves without a place to stay for their highly anticipated weekend getaway. Instead of letting the ruined plans ruin their night, Susie and Stacy decided to stay in Springfield and hop between the various graduation house parties happening across town. They spent the evening laughing, dancing, and saying their goodbyes to classmates they might never see again. Around 2 a.m., the parties began to die down. The girls were exhausted. Stacy was originally supposed to sleep over at a different friend named Janelle's house, but Janelle's house was incredibly crowded with other teenagers who had the same idea. Susie suggested that they just go back to her house on Delmar Street. It would be quiet, they could wash off their makeup, and they could sleep in late. Stacy agreed, and she called her mother to let her know about the change of plans. The house on Delmar Street belonged to Susie's mother, a 47-year-old woman named Cheryl Levitt. Cheryl was a beloved local hairdresser, an incredibly hardworking single mother who had dedicated her entire life to providing for Susie. Cheryl and Susie shared a very close, trusting relationship. They were more like best friends than a traditional mother and daughter. While the girls had been out partying, Cheryl had enjoyed a quiet, relaxing evening at home. She had spent the afternoon painting a wooden dresser in the garage. Around 11:15 p.m., she had called a friend to chat, sounding perfectly happy and normal. After getting off the phone, Cheryl presumably washed up, put on her floral nightgown, and climbed into her bed, reading a book while her small Yorkshire Terrier, Cinnamon, curled up at her feet. She left the front porch light on, waiting for her daughter to come home. At roughly 2:15 a.m., Susie and Stacy arrived at the house on Delmar Street in their separate vehicles. They parked their cars in the curved driveway, right next to Cheryl's car. They walked up the pathway, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. What happened inside that house between the hours of 2:15 a.m. and 8 a.m. is a black hole of information that has terrified investigators for decades. The next morning, Sunday, June 7th, the sun rose hot and bright over Springfield. Janelle, the friend whose house the girls had initially planned to sleep at, woke up early. She had promised to meet Susie and Stacy that morning so they could all go to a nearby water park to spend the day together. When the girls did not show up at the agreed-upon time, Janelle assumed they had just overslept. She got into her car and drove over to the house on Delmar Street. When Janelle pulled up to the house around 9 a.m., she noticed that Susie's, Stacy's, and Cheryl's cars were all parked in the driveway. This made sense. They were home. They were just sleeping. Janelle walked up the short concrete path leading to the front door. As she stepped onto the front porch, she noticed something slightly odd. The glass globe that covered the front porch light was completely shattered. Small shards of jagged glass were scattered across the concrete welcome mat. Janelle carefully stepped over the glass and reached for the front door handle. She expected it to be locked, but when she turned the brass knob, it clicked open effortlessly. The front door was completely unlocked. Janelle pushed the door open and stepped into the living room. She called out for Susie and Stacy, her voice echoing in the quiet house. There was no answer. The only sound was the frantic, high-pitched barking of Cheryl's dog, Cinnamon. The little dog was running around the living room in a state of absolute distress. Cinnamon was usually a very calm dog, but this morning she was highly agitated, pacing back and forth and whining near the front door. Janelle walked further into the house. The television in the living room was turned on, emitting a quiet hum, but displaying only static snow. She walked into Susie's bedroom. The bed looked as though it had been slept in, but the room was empty. She walked into Cheryl's bedroom. Again, the bed covers were pulled back, but Cheryl was nowhere to be found. Janelle went into the bathroom. Sitting neatly on the bathroom counter were 2 wet washcloths, carefully folded over the edge of the sink. Beside them were Susie and Stacy's makeup remover pads. This indicated that the girls had indeed made it home safely, gone through their entire nighttime routine, and prepared for bed. Starting to feel a genuine sense of unease, Janelle went back into the living room. Sitting perfectly undisturbed on the coffee table were 3 purses. They belonged to Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy. Janelle looked inside them. Stacy's wallet still contained a large amount of cash from her graduation gifts. Cheryl's purse held her keys, her money, and a pack of cigarettes she never left the house without. Women do not leave their homes without their purses. They certainly do not leave without their money, their keys, and their cars. Confused and frightened, Janelle called Stacy's mother, Janice McCall. Janice had been waiting for her daughter to come home all morning. When Janelle explained that the girls were not at the house, but all their belongings were there, Janice immediately felt a cold spike of dread in her chest. She told Janelle to stay put, and she and her husband immediately drove to the house on Delmar Street. When Stacy's parents arrived, they searched the house frantically. They looked in the closets, the garage, and the backyard. There was absolutely no sign of the three women. The house was perfectly clean. There was no blood, no overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle whatsoever. It looked exactly like a home where the occupants had just stepped into the other room for a moment. In their panic, Stacy's parents made a decision that they would deeply regret for the rest of their lives. Hoping to find a clue as to where the girls might have gone, they began cleaning up the shattered glass from the front porch. They carefully swept the shards into a dustpan and threw them into the garbage, completely unaware that they were destroying the only physical piece of evidence left at a major crime scene. While they were waiting for the police to arrive, the telephone in the kitchen rang. Janelle answered it. The voice on the other end of the line was a man. He began speaking in a deeply disturbing, sexually explicit manner. The things he was saying were so horrible that Janelle immediately slammed the phone down in shock. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. Janelle answered it, and it was the same man saying the same terrifying things. She hung up again. When the police finally arrived on the scene, they walked into a house that was now filled with panicked family members and friends. The crime scene, if it was one, had been completely compromised by people walking through the rooms, touching surfaces, and sweeping the porch. The detectives began their investigation by examining the answering machine in Cheryl's bedroom. The machine indicated that there was one new, unheard message. An officer pressed the play button. The tape whirred, and a message began to play. It was a very strange, cryptic message, but just as the investigators leaned in to listen closely, the officer's finger slipped. He accidentally hit the delete button instead of the save button. The tape completely erased. The message, and whatever crucial clue it might have held, was gone forever in a fraction of a second. Despite the blunders, the police realized they were dealing with a massive, unprecedented situation. 3 adult women do not voluntarily vanish from a locked house without taking a single personal item. The local authorities called in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The quiet street was quickly swarmed with federal agents, crime scene technicians, and tracking dogs. The technicians dusted the entire house for fingerprints. They found nothing out of the ordinary. They sprayed the carpets and walls with luminol, a chemical that illuminates microscopic traces of blood that have been cleaned up. The house glowed completely dark. There was not a single drop of blood anywhere. The tracking dogs were given the women's clothing to pick up their scent. The dogs led the handlers out the front door, down the driveway, and into the street. But as soon as the dogs reached the pavement, the scent abruptly stopped. It did not fade away into the woods. It did not trail down the block. It stopped immediately, exactly where a vehicle would have been parked. This led investigators to a chilling, undeniable conclusion. Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy did not walk away from that house. They were placed into a vehicle and driven away. But how does someone kidnap 3 healthy, capable adults from a small house in a quiet neighborhood without making a sound? Cheryl was a fiercely protective mother. If someone had broken down the door and threatened her daughter, she would have fought to the death. The neighbors, whose houses were only feet away, reported hearing absolutely nothing that night. No screams, no barking dogs, no breaking glass. The detectives realized that the shattered porch light was the key to understanding the nightmare. It was not broken during a struggle. The glass was shattered before the women ever opened the door. The terrifying theory constructed by the FBI suggests that a predator, or perhaps a group of predators, had been watching the house on Delmar Street. They saw Cheryl go to sleep. They unscrewed or broke the porch-like globe to plunge the front entryway into absolute darkness. And then they waited. When Susie and Stacy arrived at 2:15 a.m., they walked up the dark path. They unlocked the door. They stepped inside, washed their faces, and got ready for bed. The prevailing theory is that the attacker was already inside the house, hiding in the dark, or that they knocked on the door shortly after the girls arrived, holding a weapon, and forced their way inside. To control 3 adults without a struggle, the attacker would have needed an overwhelming threat. They would have needed a firearm, and they would have needed the element of total surprise. The attacker woke Cheryl up, gathered the 3 terrified women in the living room, and quietly ordered them out the front door, threatening to shoot them if they made a single sound. They were marched out into the warm summer night, loaded into a waiting vehicle, and driven off into the dark, leaving their entire lives behind on the coffee table. Years passed. The case of the Springfield 3 became one of the most heavily investigated missing persons cases in the country. The police received over 5,000 tips. They excavated concrete foundations of new parking garages, looking for bodies. They drained local lakes. They interviewed known criminals who were active in the area at the time. A few men came forward with vague confessions, hoping to get lighter sentences for other crimes, but their stories were always full of inconsistencies and led to dead ends. To this day, over 30 years later, not a single trace of Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, or Stacy McCall has ever been found. No clothing, no jewelry, no bones. The house on Delmar Street still stands, a quiet, suburban monument to an impossible tragedy. This story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a profound and terrifying exploration of how incredibly fragile our sense of safety truly is. We build our homes, we buy our locks, and we go to sleep believing that we are the masters of our domain. But the truth is, the walls we build can only protect us from the things we can see coming. It teaches us a grim, vital lesson about the fleeting nature of our reality. The graduation parties, the laughter, the mundane act of taking off makeup, all of it was erased in a matter of minutes by an unseen darkness. It reminds us that we must hold on to the moments we have with the people we love with absolute sincerity. We must appreciate the quiet evenings, the mundane conversations, and the simple comfort of knowing our family is sleeping in the next room, because life is completely unpredictable, and the universe does not guarantee us a tomorrow. Sometimes, despite our best efforts and our locked doors, the outside world reaches in and takes everything, leaving nothing behind but questions that will never, ever be answered. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves a massive ancient hotel in the middle of a bustling city and a series of security tapes that show a young woman playing a terrifying game of hide and seek with something no one else can see. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there.